we started early on doing these with members of the business community. So for lots of reasons, and it stuck. It was very popular. And then we branched out to the library and a couple other spaces. And this week we thought we would bring in our members and talk about, you know, basically the same thing that businesses have been talking to us about. You know, what's it been like navigating the pandemic? What were your biggest challenges? How did you get through them? You know, what were the biggest surprises? Just kind of an overview of what's it been like since early March.
I guess I'll dive in here. So it was chaotic in the early days. As we were taking it day by day, you know, obviously the pandemic was growing and we knew that a shutdown was probably imminent, but you never knew quite which day to shut schools down or when that was going to happen. And then it happened all pretty quickly. A couple school districts in the area closed down maybe a couple of days before us. And then the county came in and ordered them all closed. And I think we shut down on March 13th. And obviously we've been out ever since then. From a board perspective, it's certainly been a challenge in terms of logistical early on, because we had to figure out how to switch our meetings from live formats where we usually met either at the high school or at the district office, and how we were going to make it virtual. And I think we switched pretty quickly. And we started to have our meetings on Zoom, live on YouTube, and we started taking comment via Google Form linked in the agenda. And that's how we handled that issue. And we have to give a lot of thanks to our district clerk, who was basically brand new at the time when this all happened, but still found a way to get us all of those technical challenges out of the way and let us begin to meet. Another big challenge. Sorry, go ahead, Bianca.
No, I would just add that I think it's really the teachers and the administrators who really had to sort of bear the brunt of a lot of the challenges. But as a district, the unknowns, you know, and also not getting directives until the last minute. It's very, very hard to plan when you don't know if exams are being held or, you know, what's happening 2 weeks from now. So, and I don't know, you know, if that's going to change, but I think that is a huge challenge, is decisions not being handed down from the state to the school districts until the very last minute, often just with days to prepare.
Yeah, and one of the great uncertainties there, I'll give you an example of something like graduation, where there was a lot of chatter and talk and everybody wanting to know how exactly graduation was going to be handled. And it's difficult in this kind of scenario to really make plans in advance when you always know that hanging above you is that Cuomo might show up in a press conference at noon one day and totally upend your plans, because there's no advanced warning of what's going to happen. He goes to the press conference and he makes a decision, and that's that. And so anytime we've been making these decisions, we always have looming over our head, what happens if somebody higher up the food chain than us decides that what we've planned to do is not okay? And then we just have to pull the plug on something. So that's always a looming challenge. The other big challenge we had, of course, that we're right. And so we didn't get to have any of our interviews in person. You know, the board actually got to, I think at the last meeting we had in person for the board was another planning meeting or review meeting around superintendent resumes. And then we were shut down and we had to switch that to an entirely virtual process. None of us have met the new superintendent in person yet, which of course,
wow.
But soon.
We will on Monday for the first time.
You still haven't.
Still have not.
I thought you were just saying through the process you didn't. Wow.
Still have not, but will on Monday. For the first time.
I can say, you know, Tim and I, we live that same life in terms of, you know, really trying to not spin your wheels too much, figuring stuff out, because, you know, guidance can drop at any second that upends your work, but you can't stop doing that work. So you have to find a way to do what you can while you wait. And we're very sympathetic to that because we live that life.
It's a total exercise in crazy flexibility, you know. But the other thing I think that's hard is the comparison between different districts that you hear everywhere. You know, and I teach in a district, my husband teaches in another district. There's a lot of comparison, which is really difficult because every district is so different in terms of their resources, where they were with technology, their demographics. So you have a lot of, you know, last minute guidance or no guidance, and everybody's doing something different. So, I mean, I just speaking for myself, I think that was a big challenge, for everyone to manage.
I would add to that what I think is interesting about this entire process where we're often waiting for guidance from Albany. I also feel like it's also very useful to not act unilaterally and for all of us to get on the same page, whether it's different local governments or different school districts. And we all have unique needs and unique circumstances. But we deal with this regularly. Like, we've been very clear, we're not opening our playground until phase 4. And people are like, well, what about this community that's already done it? I'm like, I don't know what's going on in that community and why they've chosen to do that. But our interpretation of the guidance is this is what we have to do. And I think it really, and I appreciate Cuomo's approach too, and like trying to include the other area states. It would be great if we had a federal initiative. That would be nice too.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've talked about it a lot, but our COVID working group that contains, that we were doing daily calls since, I think they started right around when the schools closed, which yes, was March 13th, and the school districts on it, the village, fire, all the different entities. And so we definitely walk that walk locally.
Yeah, in the early days, it was pretty wild. We were meeting. There was one stretch, I think a 13-day stretch, we had 10 board meetings. And, it's because things were changing almost daily in terms of guidance and in regulations. And a new executive order was coming out each day that really affected us. And it was quite chaotic. I mean, I understand why it was. I don't fault the state for that.
Right.
Because they were dealing with it in real time, just like we were.
Yeah, I mean, how we operate as a board had to radically shift as well. There's no way that you can just meet every 2 weeks and get what you need done when you're in the middle of a pandemic.
And I think it's a difficult needle to thread, maintaining local control and having regulations that allow communities and districts to sort of modify for the needs of their community versus everybody being on the same page. I can see the need for both, but right now, everything is very much, there's some things that are mandated and some things that are left up to local control. And we don't even know what those are going to look like yet, going forward. So it's hard.
And add in the uncertainty of, forward steps, backward steps, because, if you look at what's happening in other states right now.
It's not good.
No. And that's, the idea of that trickling into New York is scary because I think the state's been working really hard. Everyone's been working hard to sort of get where we are now, and the idea that what's happening around the country could infiltrate, even decisions about schools is really disconcerting, but it's inevitable.
And it'll trickle down to us, assuming there's some level of in-person schooling in the fall. I'm sure we're going to have these cases where nearby districts are going to have some outbreaks and others are not. And you're going to deal with this issue in terms of the neighboring community has a COVID outbreak and we don't. Right. Are people going to want to take steps in terms of restricting mixing, let's say athletic events and such? And it really can be a mess. We can be seeing the same sort of issue interstate that we're seeing now, interdistrict.
And they were kind of seeing that issue in the beginning, especially after spring break, people who had traveled to COVID hotspot countries, some districts were requiring that families report it in quarantine. So that could happen.
Yeah. A lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of anxious people who need to figure out their lives. The campus just released their plan yesterday, and all the same stuff. Everybody wants to know more sooner.
Now, did Cuomo give guidance yet?
So it's hard, when you're in a leadership role, you want to be able to quell people's fears to the best that you can. And when you can't predict the future and you have to plan for multiple scenarios, it's challenging.
KT, did Cuomo give the guidance for higher ed? Did he give you guys specific guidance yet, or are you still waiting?
Each SUNY campus had to submit a plan that then system signed off on, and SUNY just got their sign off. So they just posted their plan.
And that's not contingent on anything?
Excuse me?
Is that contingent upon, is that the plan for if Cuomo gives the green light, or that's just your plan going forward?
It's the plan going forward, but the caveat, that we need to pivot is always there. The plan takes into account that possibility. I don't think the way, I still see it, even, there is a lot of details. It's not a short document, but I still see it as sort of scaffolding. And that, I know, from my union's perspective, we want to be part of the conversation of, how we implement the plan and how we figure out how to do the plan.
Yeah.
Planning isn't always, the implementation has to happen with the people who are actually doing the work. And we're hearing a lot of anxiety about sort of work-family balance and stuff like that. So I've actually been thinking about K-12 in that respect too, because that is not a local issue, right? That's an Albany issue. How are we going to make it so people can work and their kids can go to school?
Yeah. And it's hard to figure that out before we even know what's happening. It's really, and there's all different levels. You have people who are high risk, who maybe can't be in buildings for those reasons. You have, the work-life balance. I don't know, and it's really hard. People can't plan. I understand why people's anxiety is through the roof to not know what's happening 2 months from now. 2 months is not a long time. September's going to be here before you know it.
Yeah, and there's the obvious link between the relationship between schools, childcare, and the larger economy. How are we going to send people back to work if everything is still virtual in terms of schoothis?
And
yeah, I remember when we were shutting down, and Bianca knows well because I was working with her on this issue. This, how do I want to say this? I speculate that the schools would have shut down much sooner had they not had to accommodate for these issues, including food.
Mm-hmm. And that, that's it, school provides, childcare is a huge function of school, to provide respite for families and food and structure. And that absolutely, I think was one of the main concerns about shutting down, was all the families that would just be left,
right.
in the bag, so to speak.
And the kids on free and reduced lunch, making sure there was continuity there.
Yeah.
I learned early on when I was the school board, I had never thought about it before, but somebody said to me, stop it with all these snow days. These kids aren't eating. And it was like, wait, right. Yeah. And then I started studying food insecurity, and you look at the numbers, like in the summer, the numbers are off. It's like a huge bell curve because kids are getting it from other places in the summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think our thinking of our social institutions as siloed, there's been a crack in the armor of that. And now we have to think about it. But as people who represent only some of those institutions and can't supply all the solutions, it's challenging. I'm really thinking about this work balance stuff a lot. And I think that we need to, as educators, talk more to our Albany electeds about what kind of things they can do there. But of course, Albany doesn't have any money because of COVID and the pandemic. So I guess that provides a good transition to another question, which is like, what's up with the budget? Tim put out a prognosis, is that the right word, on our budget, which is basically, it's really ugly. And by the time we hit September, between our debt payments and payroll, like we have to get bailed out. And the state doesn't have a lot of the money that it usually has because of the pandemic. So how'd that work for you? I think your budget cycle is actually pretty close to ours in the village.
Yeah, our fiscal year runs July 1 to June 30.
Right. The key for the school district is taxes are due September 30, correct?
Correct.
Right. So that's what we've been focusing on is, we look at how much of our water and sewer bills get paid. Like the first line in the sand was March 30 and then June 30. And then we had tax bills due June 30. And knock on wood, people are paying their water and sewer and property tax bills. It's really not different from what we've seen in years past. And I mean, it's a blessing and a curse in that the village does not receive sales tax revenue, but we're seeing the county and the state getting really hammered by, significant haircuts in terms of sales tax revenue. But where we've gotten hurt is, something that is directly related to commerce is we've lost all parking enforcement revenue. We laid off our entire parking enforcement group, and since the middle of March, we've received about $15 in coins from meters. That's essentially nothing.
Wow. That's a huge, and what is it usually?
It's like we budgeted in the fiscal year 21 budget $520,000 in revenue for. So it's about, I think our total revenues were like 6.5 million, and straight away with no parking, we lose over $500,000.
Wow. Wow.
But that's across general fund, water fund, sewer fund.
So for us, the immediate impact wasn't as severe as it is for you, but we do expect some pain down the line. We know that there's going to be these quarterly lookbacks. That's going to be from the governor's office and the comptroller's office, where they're going to look back at state revenues and they're going to make adjustments to state aid based on what the revenue actually is. And so we're proceeding expecting that there's going to be further cuts down the line, and they're going to be in the middle of the year at various points in time, where we're going to be informed that the aid that we had been, I think promise is the wrong word, allocated, is going to be cut by some amount. So we're going to have to be ready for those issues. We also have to be prepared for the fact that there's going to be additional expenses due to COVID if we reopen the schools, right, in some capacity, whether that's additional technology to deliver to students that don't have it, PPE, cleaning and disinfecting. We might even need additional staff in terms of custodial staff, in terms of bus attendants, thermometers, all sorts of expenses that we are anticipating are going to come down the line that we're going to have to use to deal with COVID. So we've actually set aside money in the budget to handle those additional expenses.
Yeah, and just to be clear, no, there was no additional money from the state to address those expenses. There's an idea out there that the state and the feds have been giving schools money to address the COVID-related issues, and there's not. I mean, I think we budgeted for that, but that's not coming from any set aside from the feds or the state. And I think, when we talk about the lookbacks, we talked about this at one of the board meetings. What does that look like when in December, if you have a significant reduction in state aid, and when you start to look at, what can be cut, not to be alarmist, but, at some point you're talking about cutting teachers, and you're talking about combining sections of classes. And when people hear that, I think their mind is blown. I, as a teacher, can't imagine that, but that's where we're at. And that's a possibility. So when I hear, to me, mid-year cuts is something it's so hard to wrap my brain around, but that's the reality, and I think people have to really be prepared for that and understand sort of what these cuts could look like, which, not to be, doomsday, but I think you want people to sort of have an idea of what's going on and where we're at. So, we won't know. We won't know until months from now. So it's hard to even anticipate those cuts.
Right, and this is so hard to predict because it's not like an economic downturn where you can look back and say, well, this is what happens during these times. I mean, how the virus affects, just like we were talking about earlier, how it affects other states, how it affects our state. Like that's the tricky thing, is like maybe you could figure out, well, if we do need to reduce staff, what would that feel like? But until we see what happens, on a month by month basis, like it almost feels like an exercise in futility to even pencil out, what kind of reduction would this feel like, or how would this impact programming?
Yeah.
So so do you have like several scenarios that you're looking at, or how are you planning?
I think we've got some clear areas where if we had to cut, we're going to cut from. I'm not going to be alarmist and start laying them out what they are, but it of course it depends on the amount. When Cuomo was first talking about the dangers to tax revenue statewide and what that can mean to school districts, he was talking about a 20% reduction in state aid. which for us is $3.3 million. So $3.3 million to cut from the budget. That means cuts everywhere. Every single aspect of the school you can imagine is going to have a cut. That's teachers, administrators, sports, arts, everything is going to get cut at that level. So it depends. You know, when we get these lookbacks, if it's, you know, $250,000, it's going to hurt, but I think we can manage it. If it's a look back and they say you're going to get $1 million reduction, it's going to be a pretty big gutting of the district.
Do you have any sense of the magnitude of cuts that the district endured in 08?
I know that
I do.
over time.
I was on the board from 2009 to 2012, and we've reduced by 71 per staff lines, teachers plus staff. And that was during the big cuts. So every line was fought for tooth and nail. And, you know, 71 over the course of those 3 years is huge. You know, we struggle with this too. Like we don't try to portend ourselves to be doomsdayers. We're just being realistic. And we think it's important to let the public know that we have these huge deficits and these holes that need to be filled. And I mean, a lot of what the governor says and what, you know, Congressman Delgado is saying and Jen Metzger is like, we need to know the reality because the money's not going to come from the state and it needs to come from the federal government.
And I think
right now there's no indication it will.
Yeah. And I think that the part that really I think is disconcerting is the mid-year part of it. You know, I mean, I think most districts have gone through cuts, but you can plan, you know, you plan for them in June, May, you know, the community knows about them when they pass the budget in May. But the mid-year piece is really concerning. You know, you're talking.
I think that's what I was trying to say before. It's like you have, you know, it'll be so hard to predict, and any sort of like fire drill type response will be so brutal and so disruptive. So you guys have a tough task ahead. One of KT's questions, you mentioned that July 13th, we're expecting guidance from Albany. Can you help us understand what does that mean? Or
I don't know if I had the date right.
No, you do.
Or right at all.
The date is right. The date is right, but I believe that that's when the Board of Regents will meet to discuss guidance. So I don't know. To me, when I read that part, it's not clear that the guidance is actually going to be issued. They're going to have a discussion about it. Whether they'll adopt and immediately release it, I don't know. It might last on past that point. Bianca might have more details.
My impression is that they will be putting out that they're synthesis. So the Board of Regents has been holding regional reopening task force meetings, and my understanding is that they are now synthesizing all that information, and that they plan to put out the guidance on the 13th. But it's really important to separate out the Board of Regents guidance from Cuomo's executive orders, because right now they're two different bodies that are doing very different things. So the Board of Regents have gathered in each region teachers, administrators, school nurses, doctors, transportation directors, coaches, and they've been having these guidance from Cuomo's. I'm sorry, I just was hearing something. They've been holding these meetings where they are being very transparent. Everything is being videotaped. They're collating all of the concerns, and they're going to be putting out guidance based on that. But it's really the governor who will be deciding in what form we're going back. So it's not clear yet how those two governing bodies are communicating. So we might have guidance from the Board of Regents in mid-July, but that may not tell us anything about when school is reopening, how it's reopening, what social distance guidelines the executive order will contain. So I think that's where there's a lot of confusion right now.
Yeah, because Cuomo has his, out of the governor's office, is the Reimagine Education, whatever it is.
He has a reopening task force, which is, you know, a lot of CEOs from corporations, and he has his Reimagining Education task force, which seems like it's a more broader task force, looking at how can we take lessons from remote learning to reinvent public education. And their work has not been, if you look, there's not a lot out there about the work they've been doing, or sort of what the charge has been. But the Board of Regents has been very clearly posting their meetings. You can watch some of the presentations. And I mean, as board member, as a teacher, as a parent, I feel really good about those meetings because it really is an airing of all the concerns. And I also think it's very overwhelming. We have a very short time to prepare. So whether it's concerns about transportation, school nurse coverage, we all know that there's a shortage of substitute school nurses. Do we need to implement some kind of local agreements with local hospitals, that they can send nurses in the event that we can't find a substitute nurse? The range of accommodations and modifications that are going to have to be made is huge, and quite frankly, it's daunting. It's a lot.
Bianca, you're on one of those task force.
I was on the one for our region. We are region 2. I'm sorry, we're region 3. So I was on region 3. So basically it was one meeting where we went into breakout groups, and the Board of Regents is now working with another organization to help them synthesize all the feedback. And then they will put out guidelines based on all the feedback they got, which it's the scope of it is enormous. But I really appreciate that all of that feedback is being solicited, because school nurses will think of things that nobody else will think of. The transportation director will think of things that nobody else will think of, the coaches. So I think it's important for the public to know that there is a space where all of that is really being shared. What we can do about it to address all of those issues, I think that's still a really open question.
Yeah, like when I think through, if you just think through the logistics of any even singular, what seems like a small issue, you can see what a nightmare this can become. If you think about something like temperature checks, if you want to perform them, do you perform them? You would think you perform them before a kid gets on the bus, but who performs a temperature check before they get on the bus? The bus driver? Is the bus driver wearing full PPE when they do it? What do they do when that child has a temperature? Do they log it some way? How do they make sure the child gets back into their home? Is then their mandatory issue of quarantine for children who are driven. If they get dropped off when they have a temperature when they get to the school, what do you do with them? What do you do if that parent dropped them off and drove away and they have a temperature? There's so many little issues we really have to think through.
What do you do when a parent gives their child Tylenol in the morning? Because, and this does happen. I mean, any teacher will tell you that there are parents who are in really dire straits with their jobs, and and there are parents who out of desperation will give their child Tylenol and send them to school. So how are they going to address that? What do you do when a child, starts showing symptoms during the school day? Do you have a quarantine room? Do you have staff who can wear full PPE and monitor that student in the quarantine room and still have another nurse available to the rest of the school? Those are the kinds of really, really deep, nitty gritty concerns that are being discussed, that were discussed at these regional task force meetings.
Yeah, they're isolating and using one dorm on campus just for that purpose. But the temperature thing too, I mean, so many people are asymptomatic, so.
I don't know if that really.
None of it's all using everything in the toolkit. There's no one single thing. There's a multitude of interventions. And I like what you said about, you have to talk to the nurse, you have to talk to the bus driver. These are plans that absolutely have to integrate the people who live this in their daily lives.
Yeah, even to how we serve food, what the food is served on. There's so many implications of this. And I think that's the really hard part for everyone, is not knowing, because any one of the scenarios that have been talked about, whether it's a hybrid scenario or returning back to school full-time or remote learning, any one of those scenarios takes such enormous planning. I don't know that anyone can fully plan for all 3 scenarios without guidelines, or how deeply invested can you get in planning any one of those scenarios without guidelines, knowing that your entire plan you may have to throw out and start over once we get these guidelines.
And we're gonna have to be open to the fact that should whatever happens in the fall, it's a possibility we'll have to pivot based on what happens, based on the circumstance statewide, based on the circumstance nationwide, based on what happens locally. If we have some kind of outbreak or we have new guidance, and we really have to shift the whole thing. So when I think about it from a board perspective, we're going to have to make sure that we leave the space, in terms of timing, staff time, to be able to adapt and pivot once we're even into the plan. We're going to have to be able to make sure that we have the ability to change things on the fly. Because I think no matter what we put in place, let's say there's a full detailed plan in August, the idea that that plan is still going to be what we're following in November, I think it's a very high chance that it won't be. I think the plan will continue to evolve.
Right, we could be 4 weeks in and have to change everything.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry if I missed this before. So do you have 3 scenarios and now you're waiting for guidance from the Board of Regents and then you'll go with one of those? Is that kind of what we're up against?
the 3 scenarios that are being floated pretty much across the state are either a hybrid, fully remote, or full-time. So I think all school districts are really have those 3 scenarios in mind. And it's, you know, and we won't know, we don't know.
Was there all?
So in theory, if you're all in person, you can pivot to hybrid or pivot to all online.
Was there
Yeah.
also scenarios where you would maybe do something like full-time with younger kids, but remotely, or hybrid with older kids, like the high school students? Is that being considered?
Yes, it's a consideration that you would skew in-person learning time toward the younger grades, given that they would need in-person support.
But I don't know that that's
So-
necessarily like a district. I don't think that's not necessarily a New Paltz plan. That's an idea that's out there.
Yeah, no, not a New Paltz plan. And
Children, but I think that comes down to the science isn't really totally solid. You know, there's an idea out there that children are, you know, spread the disease at a much, you know, at a much smaller rate. But I think that that's also part of it, is there's so much we don't know about this disease. You know, so that idea, when I've heard that floated, is based on the idea that children are not carriers, which, as
But I thought it was also based on that it's your older kids can do online learning in a way that younger kids can't do online learning as well. It's not just contagion. It's you know.
Yeah, it's educational too. It's
and that they can also, and that
kindergartners can't do it really well. Kindergartners aren't real great on Google Classroom.
they're not, but there's also a lot of high school kids for whom the stakes are really high, right? So if we were to do that, we
Right.
would have to really change the stakes for high school students. You know, so that's another piece of this is where the regulations have to be changed. So for example, if Governor Cuomo puts out an executive order, it's then up to the Board of Regents to decide which, you know, how are we changing the structure of the regions? How are we changing the accountability metrics? Students are required to be in school for 900 hours or 990 hours, depending if it's, you know, upper or lower grades. Are we changing that? So what's been happening this year is that those changes it's taken a long time for them to come down. So without those guidelines, it's going to be very hard to know who gets seat time, you know, who works remotely, what are they doing remotely?
all right, well, we're pushing up
Would
against.
you reimagine building use? Like if you're using, you know, has anybody brought that up? I mean, if you're going to have more little kids, maybe it's not Duzine is what it is now, you know, and you use the middle school for younger kids or something like that. I mean, are districts talking about that kind of thing?
I would say yes, that's an idea that's out there, is repurposing buildings.
Or just do like a whole Montessori thing where like the older kids are with the younger kids, right?
Or have
I've
them
heard
outside,
that before.
you know, that's, I mean, I think that if we can utilize the outdoors, you know, we're gonna have, schools are gonna have to get really creative, you know, and that's, you know, and that could also be, you know, a good thing, you know, if we can get creative and have kids spending, you know, I love that idea of older kids spending time with younger kids and just being outside and, you know, making the outdoors part of our classroom. Something that sounded really crazy before is now, you know, looking like a really viable option. You know,
That was one of my other questions. As much as this has been, you know, so many negative impacts of COVID, we now have opportunities for change that we didn't before. So, I mean, Tim knows I'm on team. We got to do more work and play and everything outside. We're going to even try to do our board meeting at the end of July outside. Are there other things that you know, think you might be worthwhile experimenting with or thinking about, given there's opportunities to try things?
Yeah, I think one of the silver linings that we can see from remote learning, if we can get better at doing that, is that for students who, let's say, have long-term illnesses or injuries, students who have suspensions and such, maybe we'll now be better equipped to continue to educate them while they're not physically present in the building for whatever reason. So I think that's maybe one of the silver linings we can adapt there.
I mean, as rough as this has been, I do think there are a lot of silver linings. You know, I mean, I of course I would rather we never had to go this route, but I do think that we are having conversations about what education is that need to be had that I haven't been hearing before, at least not in the mainstream. We have an opportunity to reimagine the purpose of education and look at these accountability systems that don't work for a lot of kids and really don't lead to great outcomes, whether it's test-based accountability, whether it's, you know, not including recess as instructional time. You know, there's a lot of things that I think within this, we have the potential to change during this time so that when we come out on the other side, hopefully we'll be in a better place. You know, I think conversations about equity and understanding that schools are not just a place you go to learn to read. You know, you don't just go to school to learn to do math. It's a lot bigger than that. And schools have been given, you know, permission, and I hate to say permission, but a lot of times the accountability, you know, prevents schools from focusing on social emotional wellness and well-being. And I don't know how successful we've been on that. I think for all schools that jury is out, but at least those conversations are happening. You know, schools are really, you know, trying to focus more on well-being and not just outcomes, which I think is a positive, you know, if we can do that successfully.
Hey,
Yeah,
I'm
for
gonna-
a while, there's always been talk about this concept of wraparound services, but it's always been thought about like a big city issue. It's a poverty issue, it's a big city issue, and that's where it's confined. And I think now maybe people are realizing that this concept of community schooling or wraparound services, which involves before school care, after school care, food, the whole deal, affects everyone, everywhere.
Great. Hey, I'm gonna end the live stream just because we've tried to keep these within a certain amount of time, but thanks everyone for participating. It was really fascinating to hear from you individually.
We got
Thank
to
you.
tell you all the answers we don't have.